Well, we're going to start our today's session. Thank you very much for being here today. I'm very glad to present Sabine Kurtenbach to our second HCIAS Wednesday Colloquium. She's going to present a talk titled Peace Processes in Latin America, Ongoing Violence and Failed Reforms. Sabine Kurtenbach is the president of the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, GIGA, with a PhD in political science from the University of Hamburg. Her main fields of research are post-war societies, violence and social change, and youth, with a regional focus on Central America and the Indian region. Within the GIGA, she collaborates in research projects studying accountability and participation and peace and security. She's also an active member in the Leibniz Research Network, Environmental Crisis Environments. Recently, she co-edited the volumes Building Pathways to Peace, State-Society Relations and Security Sector Reform, and The Entanglements of Peace, Reflections on the Long Road of Transforming the Armed Conflict in Colombia. She's, since 2024, president of the GIGA. She's also co-leader of the GIGA Institute for Latin American Studies and honorary professorship or professor at the Philipps-Universität Marburg. Welcome very much, Sabine.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind invitation and the kind introduction. Just on a short note, I'm president at interim. And it's very important to me to say this because this means that I'm not doing this for a very long time. So because I love research, and if you are in charge, you have to do a lot of administrative stuff. And so I'm quite happy that this is only an interim presidency. Okay, so today I'm going to present one of my favorite topics in my research on Latin America, that is the peace processes that we saw in the region over the last decades and the problems related to this peace processes. Please. Okay. Thanks, sorry. So I will talk I will do like 6 sections. I will talk as an academic. I will first talk about some concepts that are relevant to the issues: peace, violence, reforms, all very small concepts, no, very complex concepts that need to be clarified if we want to see what went well, what went wrong. Then I will talk a bit on the context in Latin America, on war and peace. Then I will talk about reforming institutions for peace. We saw a lot of this in Latin America, but also in other post-war societies. Then I will talk about old habits that die hard, that is repression and violence as a strategy to violence reduction. And then I will talk a bit about Central America and some consequences for peace building. So peace. Peace is an empty signifier, a colleague of mine in Marburg always says, and she's right, because peace, if you talk about peace, it depends a lot on what you are thinking peace is. And we can distinguish between minimalist and maximalist concepts. A minimalist notion of peace would be like a war has ended, and so we have peace only because the violence that makes a war is not longer an everyday experience. A maximalist version of peace would be like utopian, that everybody can fulfill its own potential. This would, if we would talk with the terminology of Johann Galtung, who died a few months ago, the father of modern peace research, I would say. He used the terms of negative peace, the absence of organized violence, and positive peace that would be much more demanding, to put this. At the same time, peace is very context specific. So in in different contexts, culturally, historically, peace means different things to different societal groups. And at the same time, it's a universal aspiration. I like this painting very much. It's from Siena, from the Sala della Pace, and it's from the 14th century. And here you see a lot of elements in the painting that would resonate very well with modern conceptualizations of positive peace. Like you have justice, you have well-being for the people, you have good governance. Like this is a very comprehensive concept of peace. So, and as peace is an empty signifier, we have, like with democracy and other complex concepts, we talk about liberal peace when there is some changes in the political order, or democratic peace. We talk about territorial peace when the reduction of violence is just related to specific territories. The quality of peace, a just peace, an inclusive peace, a stable peace, the time dimension. So it always depends on what your interest is and what you are thinking about this. The other concept, no, sorry. Oops. Can I go backwards? Because I need to go back. Yeah, violence. Okay. The second concept that is relevant to our topic today is violence. And violence comes in very, very many manifestations. Johann Galtung talked about structural violence. This is a violence you don't see, you don't smell. It's just injustice and the lack of possibilities for a lot of people. And you have on the other end of a spectrum, you have the direct physical violence. If somebody gets hurt, it's a clear act of violence. You can see it, you can count it, you can try to prevent it, or you can sanction it. So violence is also a very complex concept, and war is a very specific form of following in the trajectory of Karl von Clausewitz. It's a form of organized political violence. So what we see today in Ukraine is clearly a classical war. It's one state or one regime that invaded another state's territory. And this is a classical war. Nobody would doubt this. If we look at other war theaters, like even start with Gaza, it's much more complicated, because there we might have like non-state armed actors contesting either a state or government in the control of the territory, or even contesting other non-state armed actors' influence. In Colombia, you have a lot of armed conflicts between different non-state armed groups. So this is a very different kind of war. And what we, in the public debate, there's often talk of a binary between violence is either political or it's criminal. But this is highly problematic, because all political forms of violence or even war always have a lot of criminal elements too. If you think about the Second World War, the personal enrichment that a lot of German army members did in the East by acquiring land and other resources, this was clearly not political. This was economic profit for themselves. And the same thing holds true for drug dealers and others. And criminal violence also also has a political dimension. You can see this every time that non-state armed groups that are classified as criminal want to talk with the government. Then they put themselves like a political code and say, oh, but we are political, we want to change this or that, we support the government, or we are against other insurgent groups and so on. So it's not a binary, it's more of a spectrum. And it's always dependent of the specific context, how violence is framed. So what I would argue is that the binary is very problematic because you have to acknowledge that it's fluid. You can't say it's one or the other. Most forms of violence have a bit of all of it. Say might have more political aims or more criminal aims, but it's always a combination. And peace as the opposite of war is a very minimalist notion of peace, as I said. So peace is more the opposite of violence, of different forms of violence. So we always have to see which forms of violence are acknowledged, because there's a lot of violence that is not acknowledged, not even in countries of Europe, like violence against migrants. What happens is the drowning of thousands and thousands of migrants in the Mediterranean Sea. Is this violence? Is this acknowledged as violence? Or if you look at gender violence or violence in families. So it's always dependent what forms of violence we talk about, what forms of violence are seen in the public and are recognized as violence. So this is also important to note. So the concept of reforms, and reforms are often done to prevent more violence or to prevent new violence, to transform conflict. So the first reforms we see in post-war societies is disarming non-state armed groups, DDR, disarmament, demilitarization, and reintegration. So we have all seen the very nice photos where these groups lay down their arms. In a lot of contexts, we see that they are used to do like sculptures or memorials to make sure that they are not used again. But most of these war arms, to be honest, are recycled and are used in other war theaters or in other violent conflicts. For example, if you see good German quality regarding guns, a lot of German guns from the First World War are still used today in Africa or Latin America or other violent contexts. So it's a very difficult endeavor to disarm and to destroy the arms. So a second, or the main emphasis of these processes is strengthening the state. The idea in peace building done by the United Nations and supported by Europe, by the US, by others, is always, well, you need a state, a barbarian state with a monopoly of violence, and then you can contain violence, and you can reduce violence, and you can sanction violence. So strengthening the state by security sector reform is a second important step in all these contexts. And security sector reform is mostly encompassed by DDR, demobilizing non-state armed actors, by reforming or reducing the military. Here, civil-military relations play a major role, or civil oversight on the military and on the police. And this is the core of SSR. What is often forgotten or not so prominent is that you need a functioning judiciary. So you need to reform the justice system, because the judiciary is the main link between state and society. So if you don't reform, or if you don't professionalize the judiciary, and if you don't have a functioning justice system, it will be very difficult to reduce violence, because then violence will not be sanctioned on an equal level for everybody. So if you do comprehensive reforms, you need to do a lot. So Latin America. As most of you know, Latin America has been very, very violent during the 20th century. In the second half, these are the examples where violence escalated to war, that is defined mostly by quantitative scholars as armed conflicts with at least two parties, one of them a state, and a minimum of 1,000 casualties in direct confrontations, either in a year or over a specific period of time. So we see Colombia. Colombia is the country in Latin America which has been at war for most of its history. There were few decades in Colombia that have not seen war. And if you see the different non-state armed groups, the ALN is the one the current government is now talking to next to other armed groups, but these are the traditional guerrilla groups. And in Colombia, you could also see that international fragmentations of regimes between the Soviets and the Chinese and others, they all had repercussions in Colombia's non-state armed forces. So the FARC was a classical communist campesino guerrilla. ALN was more on the side of the Castro focus guerrilla side. The EPLN was Maoist, and the M19 was more urban insurgent group. So the others in Central America, Nicaragua, you're all too young. So there was a revolution, there was a war that led to the that destroyed the Somoza dictatorship. Then there was a Contra war against the Sandinista government. In El Salvador, we had the most powerful guerrilla Latin America has ever seen. And in El Salvador, the FMLN was close to take over the government if it would not have been for the heavy support the Salvadorian regime got from the United States. There were some people who counted who made up the sums what El Salvador got, the military and the government got, and some say it was $1 million a day. So this is really, it's a tiny, small country, so this was really a lot. And Guatemala might have been the bloodiest war because this was a war, but it was a war against the civil indigenous population who did not even fight, most of them. This was a scorched earth campaign for over 400 communities destroyed, and for over 250,000 indigenous people died. And then we have the outlier. This is Peru. In Peru, the war started with the democratization. In all the other countries, well, Colombia was and has been a formal democracy for many, many decades. But in Central America, the wars all had the aim to increase participation, to open up the regimes of inclusion, be it political, be it social, be it economic. So in Peru, the war began when democratization started by the Maoist Sendero Luminoso. This person here in the middle is Abimael Guzman. And this was quite a counter or contrafactual case. And it was in Peru, we didn't see a peace process. This is why I won't talk more about Peru, because we had an authoritarian regime that ended the war by fighting or by a military victory. And then we had like a small revival of Sendero Luminoso in a few years, and then it was over. Although it's not really over because we have some small splinters of Sendero still in the Peruvian Andes. So then peace. Latin America also has a very long history of peace. Here on the left upper side, you see Daniel Ortega and Violeta Chamorro when Violeta Chamorro, the leader of the opposition, was elected president, and he and Daniel Ortega conceded and stepped down as president. He learned a lot by doing this once. He said this won't happen a second time. And then you have down there, you have Guatemala, where you had a real big celebration in 1996 when they signed the peace agreement. Although in Guatemala, there was always the joke, how many people has the Guatemalan guerrilla? 1,005. 1,000 in the country and 5 in exile in Mexico, which was the leadership. So in Guatemala, when they signed the peace agreement, the war was really already over. Because this was 96, and the most violent years were between 82 and 84. So then El Salvador, which was also the big success story, like a mediation first by the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, then by the mediation of the United Nations, and a very solemn celebration in Mexico when they signed the peace agreement. And this was like 25 years. This was in 2017. It was a big thing to do. And El Salvador was the case where really you had, after 20 years, after the peace agreement, the former guerrilla was elected, a former candidate of the guerrilla was elected president. So this was the poster child of liberal peace building. And liberal peace building from the United Nations was really modeled after the Salvadorian peace agreement. So the idea was you have democratization. The democratization leads to the elections of governments that are more responsive to what people want. So you prevent more violence and you change even structural causes of violence. This was the idea, the theory. I will talk about the empirical evidence later. And here on the right-hand side below, this was the signature of the Colombian peace agreement in 2016. And afterwards, CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, declared itself a zone of peace. Latin America was free of armed conflict, which was not so true. So, as I already said, reforming institutions meant in Latin America mostly democratization, elections, broadening the political spectrum, but in most places, astonishingly, the old elites stayed in power. So you see Calderón Sol, who was a coffee magnate. We see Álvaro Azú, who was also one of the very rich persons in El Salvador. You see, Violeta Chamorro might be a bit less an example, but her husband was the editor of the most important newspaper under the Somoza dictatorship, and he was murdered by Somoza. So she was the bearer of the more bourgeois opposition or the elite opposition to Somoza. And even in Colombia, we saw that after a failed peace referendum and a second signature of the peace agreement, a right-wing president was elected because people said, no, we don't want this. So Ivan Duque was elected president, and he campaigned on, he wanted to disrupt the peace agreement. He couldn't because his predecessor, Juan Manuel Santos, was quite clever. He changed, he put it in the constitution so that for 12 years, no government could touch it. So this was really a good thing for Colombia, because otherwise it's complicated today, but it would be even more complicated if that hadn't been the case. So reforming institutions is also, for democracy, you need parties and parliaments. We know this, we're going to elect European Parliament on the 9th of June. So political parties and parliaments should be, or this is the idea, should be organized along political interests and representation. But in Latin America, as in other cases too, we see a lot of clientele organizations, the importance of discourses and persons. And on a side note, it's quite interesting that with the election of Donald Trump, a lot of American political scientists started to look at Latin America, what they can learn from the populists over there. They said, oh, we should have noticed this before. Okay, so on a side note, so and if you don't have political parties and politicians who respect the rules of the game, or who undermine the rules of the game, it's very difficult to really change things. So reforming institutions, and this is really one of Latin America's exceptional experiences, the topic of transitional justice. Latin America, next to South Africa, Latin America has taught the world how you can cope, or how you can, yes, cope with mass atrocities of the past. And we have a lot of truth commissions with international and even German participation in Guatemala, for example. And we have a huge documentation of all the things, the bad things, the cruel things that happened. But it always comes with a but. In most cases, documentation of gross human rights violation did rarely lead to prosecution or to recompensation of victims. So this is, you have this, it's really a treasure to have on knowledge, on historical knowledge. And it's interesting that in Guatemala, you had 2 truth commissions, one official. And here the government and the military learned a lot of the Salvadorian case. They said, oh, and because in El Salvador, they were allowed to name responsibilities, personal responsibilities. And they said, no, this won't happen to us. So in Guatemala, the mandate of the Truth Commission was very, very restricted. And anyhow, they wrote about genocide against the indigenous population. And because the mandate was restricted, the Human Rights Office of the Catholic Church went to the communities and made his own documentary, Guatemala Nunca Más. This is like a 12-volume history of really things you don't want to know. It's really, the cruelty in Guatemala is quite exceptional. And I'm going to talk a last time on Peru. Peru also had its Truth Commission, but it was more related to the end of the Fujimori regime. But in talking to the director of the Truth Commission, he said, well, we had a very brave moment, but then nothing happened. So here, Peru resembles the experience of other Latin American countries. The exceptional Truth Commission in Latin America is Colombia. The Justicia Especial para la Paz, the special judiciary for peace, is really one of the most interesting experiences we have across the world, because it's a long time endeavor. They have a mandate of more than 12 years, and they really not only documented what happens, they also analyzed the structures, the causes, and the special judiciary also has the mandate to propose sanctions to the perpetrators. They do it, they pass them over to the normal judiciary, but if those people, it's a bit like in South Africa, those who declare or who contribute to the clarification of the past get reduced sentences. So there's a lot of incentive for the perpetrators to cooperate with the HCIAS. And this is quite interesting, because today even non-state armed actors who were framed as criminal, like the paramilitaries, say, we want to go to the HCIAS because there they have the chance to get reduced sentences. Even the military have talked about, we want to go to the HCIAS. And it's a quite interesting dynamic we see in Colombia. So reforming institutions, I said at the beginning, was aimed the state, strengthening the state was a main target. However, the 1980s and 1990s saw a decade of neoliberal austerity in Latin America. And Latin American states, except for Cuba, Brazil, and Argentina, and some Caribbean states, really have no financial capacity for social protection and social policies. If you see in Europe, you have like quotas from the state, and the portion the state receives from taxation of 30% on the lower side. And in Latin America, for example, in Guatemala, it's like 14%. And Guatemala, many of the last years, they had like even a quota in the peace agreement, and they never reached those 15% that were put there. And others. And this is the influence of the traditional elites who say, oh, no taxation, this is communism. So this is one of the main mancos, I would say. So, but we have other continuities in Latin America. Land tenure. Latin America is not only one of the most violent regions, it's also one of the most unequal regions regarding income, and most of all regarding land. And this is a line of continuity from the colonial times until today. And Colombia, again, is a very interesting case because the peace agreement in Colombia has like a very small agrarian reform, that is the state buys land from those who have the land and distributes it to the former FARC members. The point is, so no despropriation, nothing, very capitalistic, buy it, we give it. So they started to do this, but it's like on a very slow and low level things. Nothing happens much. And so the land problem, although it might not be as pressing due to other economic changes as in the past, we saw it during COVID. People who have a tiny piece of land are able to feed their families. Those who have not access to land, they starve or they go to drug production because it's the only way they can survive. So this is one of the continuity lines. Another level of continuity is violence. While we don't have open wars in Latin America, we still have a lot of one-sided violence. This is violence by the state or by other armed actors against civil society. We have a lot of state-based violence or repression, and we have a lot of non-state violence, armed groups. Like in Colombia, you have the Clan del Golfo, which is a former post-paramilitary, now criminal drug organization, but whose leaders say, oh, we are political. So those groups have a very flexible regarding adaptation to changing context. So we do have still a lot of violence in Latin America. And then the other pressing issue is homicide rates. That is violent death per 100,000 population people. And here Latin America is way above the global level and is way above European or other levels. And while there are some exceptions, for example, in the Southern Cone, homicide rates have always been much lower. And the World Health Organization talks about violence to be endemic when it's over 10 per 100,000. Here in Germany, I think it's 1.5. And in the US, it's 10. And if you look at this, and these are from 2023, where El Salvador dropped its homicide rate significantly. But El Salvador had a homicide rate way above 80, 90, some years over 100. So, and this is a problem, although careful, data are always the first victim of narratives. So, because in many countries, the question is, if you look at homicide data, who records what homicides? And I know a lot of people say, well, why should I care and go to the police? They won't know it, they won't write it down. Nothing will happen. I only make myself suspicious if I go and say they murdered my neighbor. So why should I take the trouble? So homicide data are always a bit problematic. Also, they are at least an indicator, to put it, for something that's not going right. And Latin America also has the charm to be home of the 10 most violent cities across the globe. If you look at this is a list that is yearly, that is put up to date yearly, and it's the first non-Latin American city is Cape Town in South Africa. So, and this is really another problem. And it's mostly Tijuana, it's Caracas, and so on. It's mostly Mexico, Venezuela, Brazil. Those countries who are not post-war countries. So violence is a problem across Latin America. So what went wrong? We have a zone of peace, but we have a lot of violence. We have a lot of structural violence, direct physical violence, and so on. So my argument is resistance to reform. We have to look at this. So there are mostly three mechanisms how traditional elites and other groups that are not favoring reforms resist reforms. One is corruption. Latin America is also a region of very high levels of corruption. So interestingly, the countries, well, Uruguay is always the usual suspect to be on the good side, but it's a very tiny, small country with a rather egalitarian structure regarding wealth and possibilities. Chile is on the good side, but all the others, you name it, it's very problematic. And corruption, in Colombia, you have the slogan, it's plata o plomo. And this is that organized crime offered you can either give us money or we shoot you. So it's plata o plomo. So this has a very long tradition. And one of the most public cases was the Odebrecht history, where across the world we saw how much economic, political, military elites in Latin America were involved in this. You might also remember Brazil in the Lava Jato. So this is a bit disputed what happened there. But all the major corruption scandals. On the other side, the saying or accusing somebody of corruption is a very good mechanism to political death, because you can accuse somebody. Mostly it's not you can prove it or whatever. So this is also a way to delegitimize political actors. But so you also have to be quite careful. So another way to resist reforms is by repression. We see this is El Salvador, and on the right side, it's Ecuador. It's while violence in these countries is really a problem, I'm very convinced that you can't cope with violence using more violence and dehumanizing the prospective perpetrators, because in El Salvador, you have currently like 70,000 young men incarcerated without a trial, without proof, without anything. So they are just out of the street, and well, Salvadorians say, well, but we can go out of the house in the evening and stroll around. But I have a doctoral student from El Salvador, and he says, well, if you look at it today, the extortion that was done by the gangs formerly is now done by the police, but people don't accuse or don't go to the police to tell it, because it's no way. So careful. But it's highly popular. Bukele has approval rates of 70 to 80%. And in a lot of other Latin American countries, they say, we want a Bukele. And Bukele himself frames him as the Messiah who's going to solve the country. And another form of violence and resisting reform is selective political violence. Latin America is also the region where the most assassinations and attacks on human rights defenders and social activists take place, and most of all in the context of environmental conflicts, of mining conflicts, where communities try to defend their right to access to land. So these are three very ugly forms of contestations, because they don't respect democracy and they don't respect democratic rules. But I don't want to close on a negative note. The way forward, how could things change in Latin America. I think I'm convinced one way is we need constructive relations between state and society. One of the main deficits of the peace processes was, and in Colombia it still is in part, a lack of inclusion of civil society actors. Civil society and communities need to have a say in these affairs. They need to be part of shaping the future. And my major or my favorite example always is if you talk to people and ask them, well, what's peace for you? Tell me what you think peace is. In the major cities, in the capital cities, the elites say, well, they lay down their arms and behave. If you talk to people in the communities, what is peace? In Guatemala, indigenous women told me, well, it's recompensation for 500 years of racism and inequality. So how can you reconcile these two very different versions of what peace is? And so you have to include actively people to build peace. It's not a thing that the United Nations can do. It's not a thing even a government who might have the political will to do it can do alone. It needs to be an effort, and it's a complicated form of contestation and reform and agreement, dialogue between a variety of groups. So this is one. So to do this, the first thing that would be necessary is to end the criminalization of social protests. What we see in Latin America is that we have a lot of protests that is criminalized by the governments. And, oh, it's the droga cartels, the drug cartels. Oh, it's the criminals. Oh, it's the Castro-Chavismo, which is the new form of saying it's the communists. No, it's not acknowledging or not acknowledging the right of others to contest civilly without violence policies. So if you don't recognize this, you destroy freedom of press, you destroy freedom of assembly, you destroy a lot of political and civil human rights that are necessary to cope with violence. The second thing is, peace is more than the end of war. You need to sanction all forms of violence. And these are data on gender violence. So if you don't recognize that violence is not, that violence beyond the political, in parentheses, needs to be sanctioned by the rule of law and needs to be coped with, there are no different forms of violence. Violence in these post-war societies and even in the post-authoritarian societies, gender violence, for example, can reactivate a lot of trauma people had. So it's for the victim, it doesn't matter if the violence they experience has a political or a non-political background. So if you really want to change these societies and legitimate like civilian and non-violent change, you need to sanction all forms of violence. And last not least, you need to transform conflicts. And here Latin America is not only always on the bad side. The agreement of Escazú is one of the very innovative ways of trying to transform environmental conflicts. Latin America is always very good at signing agreements. It's much on the deficitarian side when it goes to implementation, and this is one of the big topics today between the state, economic elites, international firms that have a lot of interest in all the mining and look at even energy transition, who has the Chile, a lot of minerals we need for electro batteries, and that's come from Latin America. And it escaped me. And so we are also part of this conflict. We also have to see this. Or I always think it's totally absurd that the German government pressured the Colombian government to send more Colombian carbon to Germany when the war in Ukraine started, because when we are done with this, we will help you renaturalize this. I think I understand the logic behind it, but I think it's really hypocrisy and it's not as it should be. So this is part of it. So we are all part of this. This is really not just a Latin American problem, but the support should be for the implementation of the Escazú agreement. So 3 takeaways. Peace is a process beyond the end of war. Reforms are contentious and all forms of violence matter. We need peace as a process, including incremental, increasing physical integrity for everybody, enabling or respecting human rights, and not just the liberal individual human rights, also the collective social and cultural and economic rights of groups. And we need to transform conflicts, because otherwise we will only reproduce whatever there has been in violence. That's it. Thank you.